I'm Nick Pope. I worked for the British government for 21 years at the Ministry of Defence, and for 3 of those years I ran their UFO project. The Rendlesham Forest incident from December 1980 is really the best case in the British government's files. It's a multiple witness event. It took place over 3 consecutive nights. Those witnesses, the majority of them were United States Air Force personnel, so it's a military case. There's good physical evidence. The UFO was tracked on radar, and this wasn't just lights in the sky. On the first night, it's alleged that an object actually landed, and sure enough, there was physical trace evidence in terms of indentations in the frozen solid ground where an object apparently weighing several tons had indeed come down. But far more pertinently, when they checked that area with a Geiger counter, they found radioactivity levels significantly higher than the average background. And that's an official assessment from the Ministry of Defence's Defence Intelligence staff and from Colonel Charles Holt, who was the Deputy Base Commander at the time, who took his disaster preparedness officer out there to the landing site with the Geiger counter. And Colonel Holt, by the way, was one of the witnesses himself on the 3rd night of activity. So a case, in terms of hard evidence, doesn't get much better than that. Project Condign was a Ministry of Defence intelligence assessment of the UFO phenomenon. In other words, instead of investigating on a case-by-case basis, which we'd done over many years, 12,000 sightings in the database, what we did was try to do some trend analysis, draw it all together and say, well, what are we dealing with here? What, if we put all this together, what have we got? What are the threats? What are the opportunities? So Project Condign was an attempt to do that, proper intelligence assessment of the phenomenon as a whole. And the final report was classified secret UK eyes only. It ran to about 168 pages, as I recall, and it was a pretty explosive document in terms of making a compelling case for a phenomenon of some sort, and talked about physical effects on the environment, talked about physiological effects, for example, on close encounter witnesses, including the Rendlesham Forest witnesses. And there's a great, powerful line in that final report, and it says the well-reported Rendlesham Forest incident is a case where it might be supposed that witnesses were irradiated for longer time periods than is normally the case with UAP witnesses, and UAP is what we in the Ministry of Defence called UFOs, unidentified aerial phenomena. In 2010, I attended 2 Royal Society discussion meetings in the United Kingdom. The first one was called The Detection of Extraterrestrial Life and the Consequences for Science and Society. And the second one was entitled Towards a Societal Agenda on Extraterrestrial Life. And this was a multidisciplinary attempt to draw together not just astrophysicists and cosmologists, but psychologists, anthropologists, theologians, everyone, and bring them together and say, never mind, is there or isn't there alien life? Let's assume there is and we find it. What then? What will the effects be? What will the implications be? And it was fascinating. And to pick out some of the moments, I mean, I think Stephen Dick, as a former chief historian of NASA, speculating that when we encounter extraterrestrial life, we will be dealing with, and these were his words, immortal thinking machines. And he said, we may find that we are living in a largely, and again, this is a direct quote, post-biological universe. When you hear somebody like that use those terms, I joke and said I had to pinch myself and remind myself that I was at the Royal Society and not at a sci-fi convention. Well, there are a number of document releases going on at the moment. Firstly, the British government is in the final stages of declassifying and releasing its archive of UFO files, and this is around 60,000 pages of documents, and again, some of them highly classified, very interesting sightings, but also policy documents. In parallel with that, the Pentagon's UFO program, AATIP, Advanced Aviation Threat Identification Program, the existence of which was revealed by the New York Times on December 16th, 2017. There is mention actually in a subsequent media article in the Washington Post. It was first revealed that one of the things that the Pentagon's AATIP unit had was a 490-page dossier, a sort of crown jewels, the best of the best when it comes to UFO sightings, not just from the United States, but all around the world. Now, multiple Freedom of Information Act requests have been put in for that dossier and indeed for all sorts of AATIP-related paperwork. As yet, there are not substantive replies to those requests, but we're in a very interesting time period now, and of course if we can get our hands on that dossier, it's going to be very interesting indeed. In 1993, I was at the MOD's UFO project, and we were setting up, and when I say we, I mean myself and my opposite number in the Defense Intelligence staff. We were doing the initial scoping for the work that would eventually evolve into Project Condign. And we felt that to get the subject taken seriously within the Ministry of Defence and to get funding for this study, we needed to reframe the debate. And in order to reframe the debate, we felt that we needed to change the language because, quite frankly, the term UFO had acquired so much pop culture baggage that it was impossible to have a serious discussion about the subject without people rolling their eyes, looking up to the ceiling, and talking about little green men and flying saucers. So we deliberately, not with the public, but internally, in our policy documents, in our discussions and meetings, we dropped the term UFO and we replaced it with UAP, Unidentified Aerial Phenomena. And it was a successful tactic. Now, we weren't necessarily the first to come up with that phrase. I've heard it suggested that some people in the UFO community had used that term or similar terms before. That may be true, but we adopted it as a deliberate policy decision to reframe the debate, and it worked. Now, after I left the Ministry of Defence, in June of 2011, I attended a private briefing in Washington, D.C. with a number of different people, some of whom were at high level, and one of the people there was John Podesta, President Obama's former Chief of Staff, and he was very interested. I briefed him about the MOD's UFO project, I briefed him about Project Condign, and I specifically briefed him, and he was very interested in this change of the language. And so I was quite amused a couple of years after that, watching Hillary Clinton go on to the Jimmy Kimmel show, and when he asked her about UFOs, she interrupted and said, no, there's a new term now, UAP. And I thought, of course, the reason she was using that term was Podesta had briefed her about our discussion on it. So all this is important, I think, in changing people's attitudes about this and getting a more serious scientific, political, academic discussion about this topic. Questions about disclosure always make the supposition that there's something there tangible to be disclosed, as opposed to maybe, there's something there, but we don't necessarily, even within government, know what it is. So I think I differentiate. I talk about disclosure with a big D. That's what the UFO community imagine, and they think it's going to be the president going on TV one evening saying, my fellow Americans, people of the world, we are not alone. That's disclosure with a big D. Disclosure with a little d is, I think, more subtle, more likely, and I would say that's happening right now, it's the declassification and release of files. It's the process of information about the Pentagon's program and the associated videos of military jets chasing UFOs. That material slowly coming out into the public domain. It's an interesting situation. Some of the people involved in looking at this within government, some mavericks within government, some believers in government, have now joined up with an organization called the To the Stars Academy, and effectively this believer faction in the government, I sense, has hit some roadblocks. They've taken it as far as they can in government, and they're now taking things forward through the To the Stars Academy, through private sector defense contractors, organizations such as Bigelow Aerospace. And we've seen 3 videos put into the public domain. There is talk of many more such videos coming out in the next few weeks and months. Some of that material may already be with the To the Stars Academy, in which case it should be released reasonably soon. Some of it may still be with the Pentagon, in which case, who knows, maybe all bets are off. But either way, what's happening at the moment, starting with the New York Times breaking this story just before Christmas 2017, and it's continuing as I speak, what's happening is a gradual process, I think, of bringing this subject out of the fringe and putting it where it belongs in the mainstream. And that's an ongoing process, and we are clearly in for a very interesting time in the immediate future. Read widely, have a look at the New York Times and the Washington Post articles about these recent revelations about the Pentagon's UFO program, and use that as maybe a springboard for some further research. Don't believe everything you hear, particularly in some of the more extreme corners of the UFO and conspiracy theory community. There is some bogus information out there, but there's some very solid and verifiable information too, like most things in life. So you do need your critical thinking skills as you go into this subject. You do need to kind of think, well, wait a minute, does that stack up? But always check your sources, see if you can trace something back to the original point where this came from. If you can go to a government archive. In other words, don't necessarily read, for example, on Project Condign, Ministry of Defence study. Go back and read the original report on the website of the UK National Archives, for example. So always go in with those critical filters set fairly carefully. But there's some great information out there. This subject is interesting. It can be fun. It can be frustrating. But in all of this, I say to people many times, I say that the skeptics have to be right every single day, but the believers only have to be right once.